اسمي دكتور كريستوف. أنا أستاذ الإسلام هنا في الإيطالية. درست اللغة الفصحى اللغة العربية في القاهرة. الآن أنا أستاذ الإسلام وأنا أدرس حياة أهل البيت، حياة فاطمة، حياة السيدة زينب. أنا أحب أهل البيت وأحب زينب وفاطمة، وأحب الكلام عن فاطمة عن أهل البيت. شكرا. I have dedicated all of my academic life to the Ahl Bayt, specifically the members of the Ahl Bayt around Karbala, that is Lady Fatima, her children. One of the things that I've grown to understand is that in every generation, God raises up spectacular human beings, and he raises them up to be universal models, not for the particular family. Lady Fatima or Al-Hussein or Al-Abbas, they are not simply there for the Shia community. So you have this ongoing reflection of the virtues passed down from generation to generation. But they are all one light, this is true. Outside of my own faith tradition, in which there are many extraordinary holy people, God has raised up models and icons for faith, for submission to him, for obedience to his revelation, the virtue of courage, the virtue of selflessness, the virtue of integrity, standing for justice. These are not necessarily just for religious people. And I think that I am trying to introduce not only to a Christian readership, but a wider Western readership. On the day of Karbala, she was transformed. On that day, Lady Zeynep became everything that God created her to be. He created her for that day and for what she would do on that day. The secular world always criticizes the Catholic Church and Islam for pushing women down. No, at the heart of these two faiths, you have these two women who have more power than you can imagine, given them by God. It is a mystery of God's greatness and God's grandeur that God is one. And although we can find some human language to describe it, in the end it is mystery, because God has revealed enough for us to journey our lives towards him, but he has not made a complete revelation of himself. What we mean is he is far above anything we can say about him. He is far removed from any statements that we can formulate for ourselves about him. Even if those statements are correct, he is still above them.
ورحمة الله وبركاته. نرحب بكم في سلسلة حوارات فكرية ومعرفية على قناة حيرة. We are honored today interviewing Professor Father Christopher Clohessy, who's talking to us from Rome in Italy. He's a professor of Islamic Studies, Shia Studies, and Islamic and Christian Comparative Studies. He's the author of several books, such as Fatima, Daughter of Muhammad, and Half of My Heart, The Narratives of Zainab bint Ali, and Angels Hastening, The Karbala Dreams, and also he was working on a new book which is called Al-Abbas ibn Ali. So welcome, Professor. It's an honor having you with us today.
Thank you.
So in the beginning, just tell us more about yourself, about your academic and spiritual journey. So you are a father, a Christian Catholic professor from Italy who became interested too much in Islamic studies and the main characters in Islam, and in Shia studies, which are Hazrat, the Lady Fatima, the Lady Zainab, or Imam Ali, or his son Abu al-Fadl al-Abbas, or Imam Hussein, and the story of Karbala, and all these studies. So what is so special and interesting and attracting that you found in Islamic studies in general and in Shia studies in specific, and why you dedicated your life and trying to studying and presenting these realities to people or to the English reader? And also I'd like to know about your interest in comparative studies between what you found in Islamic studies and then compare it with Christian studies, especially in Lady Fatima and then Mary, or Sayyida Maryam as we say. So Just in the beginning, just tell us a summary about your interests, and then we'll go and tackle several detailed topics.
Good, thank you. So I'm in fact not Italian. I was born in South Africa. I'm a South African, and it was in South Africa that I studied Catholic theology, and I eventually was ordained to the Catholic priesthood. And I worked for a number of years in South Africa, always aware that wherever I worked, there were large Islamic communities around me. And not only around me, but that many of my own community members in the church where I served had family who had converted to Islam. And of course, they're still family. You can't just cut them out and say, well, they're no longer part of our community. I felt that they were still part of our family. And so I thought it would be a good thing to make a study of Islam, but not a Western study of Islam, not Islam that is user-friendly for Western people. I would prefer to know what Islam says about itself and how Islam understands itself. So I went to Cairo to study classical Arabic, and then to Italy, where there is a university for Islamic studies and Arabic. And there I completed a master's degree in Arabic and Islamic studies, and then decided to continue with a doctorate. But I thought to specialize in Shi'i studies. And this was because back in 2000 or 1999, when I was doing my studies, very few Western scholars had bothered to study Shi'i Islam, the Ahl-Bayt, the history of the Imams. And I thought that I would do that, partly because there are many similarities between Shi'i spirituality and theology and Catholic spirituality and theology. So I was going to do a doctorate on Al-Hussein, specifically Al-Hussein through the eyes of a Christian theologian, to see the universal similarities that are applicable to any religious group and the things that make him iconic. But as soon as I started to work on Al-Hussein, of course, I discovered the Lady Fatima, and she became my great love. For many years, I decided that I would much prefer to write on her, because despite her being greatly revered and honored and loved throughout the Islamic world, but especially, of course, the Shi'i world, I was surprised at how few books there were about her. There were many little booklets in Arabic and in Farsi, but an academic work based on the sources for a Western readership didn't exist. And I thought that I would like to introduce the Lady Fatima to the Western world, hoping that people would find her as attractive as a personality as I did. And so I produced what I think was the first academic biography based on the primary Arabic sources, that is the Hadith and the books of history, both Sunni and Shia, and I will explain that in a moment, and produced, therefore, this biography, which I think was then the first bookwork on Lady Fatima. Now there are a good number of books. One of the things I wanted to show was that Lady Fatima was not a creation of Shia Islam. In other words, it wasn't that the Shia built a theology around her that was non-existent, but that she is equally important in all of the books of Islam, including the Sunni books of Hadith, that she plays a central role in the life of her father and in those opening years of his preaching and of revelation, and that despite what some Orientalists said, that she played no role at all, she did. And so the book was an attempt to disprove some Orientalists and to show that Lady Fatima, even in the Sunni books, was absolutely crucial to the life of her father and crucial to those opening years of Islam. And so from then on until today, as I speak to you, I have dedicated all of my academic life to the Ahl-Bayt, specifically the members of the Ahl-Bayt around Karbala, that is, so Lady Fatima, her children, and some of the others who were actually involved in the battle with Al-Hussein. And I have, in fact, just last week, finished the book on Abu al-Fadl al-Abbas and submitted it for publication. It's been a difficult book to write because there are very few primary sources about al-Abbas. We know some of the events on the day of Karbala, but in terms of the early history of Islam and the texts we have very little about his early life, besides the fact we know, of course, who his parents are. So it's been quite a challenging work But I am greatly devoted now to Al-Abbas, who has been my companion for 4 years, 3 or 4 years, and I hope that the book will introduce him to a Western readership as an icon and a model of devotion to God, but also selflessness when it comes to serving those around you, especially the poor, in his case, the women and the children who need water. And the fact that he would give his life to give water to some children and some women, for me, is an extraordinary thing, considering the world we live in. And therefore, I think he would be a great model.
Very, very interesting. So in the beginning, I'd like to ask you, after a long experience in working and dedicating your academic life to Ahl al-Bayt and studying about them, so what are the main lessons, theologically, spiritually, ethically, practically, that you gained as a person, as a human in your life? So what are the main things that you can say about them that is also beneficial to the people of this time and this life? In general, people who are religious or not religious. So you're studying very great characters over the history of human life. So Hazrat Ali or Sayyida Zainab, Sayyida Zahra alayhi salam, or even Abu al-Fadl al-Abbas, you mentioned these 4 years you were working on him. So I just like to know the very top points or crucial points, or what we say, the outstanding things that you can say about them.
I have come to believe, as I grow older, because with age comes a little wisdom, I hope, but also as I have studied the lives of all of these important members at the beginning of historical Islam, so Lady Fatima and Ali and their family, and then the next generation. One of the things that I've grown to understand is that in every generation, God raises up spectacular human beings. And God is not bound by our religious families. He can raise up these spectacular human beings in any religious family, and he raises them up to be universal models, not for the particular family. Lady Fatima or Al-Hussein or Al-Abbas, they are not simply there for the Shia community. I think that they are universal models, each of them playing a different role. Lady Zainab, of course, as well. And that I've come to understand that outside of my own faith tradition, in which there are many extraordinary holy people, God has raised up models and icons for faith, for submission to him, for obedience to his revelation in other religious families too. And I would be sad if people as extraordinary as Lady Zainab, and I have a very particular devotion to Lady Zainab, but also now Al-Abbas, Lady Fatima, Al-Hussein, if these were known only in a small community, a small faithful community in one particular part of the world, and not universally known and revered, I think that people like Al-Abbas, Lady Zainab have lessons to teach contemporary society. And that those lessons are for everybody, not just for religious people, not just for Muslims or for Christians or for any other religious group, not even just for non-believers, but the virtues that are lived by people like Lady Zainab and Al-Abbas. These are human virtues. They are not just religious virtues. In other words, they are virtues that ought to be lived by every human being, no matter who they are. The virtue of courage, the virtue of selflessness, the virtue of integrity, standing for justice. These are not necessarily just for religious people. And I think that I am trying to introduce not only to a Christian readership, but a wider Western readership, some of these extraordinary people who have, in all truth, helped to shape my own spiritual journey. I'm a devout Christian and I'm a faithful Christian, and my journey has in part been shaped by these extraordinary members of the Ahl Bayt who live virtues that I wish I could live in a far better way.
Very interesting. And so, Professor, how do you compare or combine between your dedication and love to the characters of Ahl al-Bayt and your personal belief in Christianity and the characters of the Christian faith? So, obviously, you're from another society and religious background. So, when you come among such different theology, so then do you compare between the characters of your faith, or do you shape a developed kind of understanding your Christian beliefs and practices also, or you gain from both religions, you take wisdom from both places? So what's the understanding that you developed after this academic and spiritual journey for your personal understanding and practice?
I'm always very careful about drawing parallels, similarities. First of all, because whenever we have interreligious dialogue, we always talk about things we hold in common, but anyone can do that. That's not a challenge. Commonalities are simple. Far more is to be challenged by what the other person believes and the things that shape that person's life. So we're inclined, for example, to draw parallels between Jesus and Al-Hussein, but Al-Hussein is not Jesus, he's Al-Hussein, and he is a unique individual, and Jesus is not Al-Hussein. Each of them has their own particular spirituality and value and virtue. And so I've allowed myself over the years to be shaped by my own tradition, but also by the traditions of others, without any challenge, without any compromise. I am as perfectly at home reading about Lady Fatima and drawing lessons from her life as I am reading about the Lady Mary in Catholicism and drawing lessons from her life. Because I think in the end it is God who raises these people. It's not us who create them. And if God raises them up, then it means there is something that he wants to teach us through them. And the more I can learn, the happier I am. And therefore I'm happy to spread my net very wide in the hope of gathering information and gathering wisdom from all of these people. Each of them has a particular virtue that attracts me, and it's that keeps me reading more and more. And now I'm finished with Al-Abbaas. I will have to find some other character about whom I can start to write. I thought maybe Fatima al-Ma'soum, because I visited her shrine in Qum a few weeks ago, and I thought I would like to write a biography of this sinless, this impeccable woman whose shrine dominates the city. And I might well try to do something, but we will have to see. Yeah?
Mm-hmm. So throughout your journey, and any person who's faithful, he goes through certain spiritual experiences and feelings. So towards Ahl al-Bayt, and you mentioned that towards Hazrat Zainab you have the most dedication or love. So if you tell us certain incidences where you felt immersed in a character, whether Zainab or Sayyida Zahra or anyone else.
So the book on Lady Zainab, which, like the book on Al-Abbaas, was quite difficult in that we know historical accounts of Lady Zainab, especially around the Battle of Karbala, but not so much about her early life. I named the book Half of My Heart, Nis Qalbi, because it was part of a lament that Lady Zainab cried out when the women were driven from their tents and there saw the bodies of Al-Hussein and his companions. And she referred to her brother as half of my heart. And I named the book that partly because I became truly dedicated to her. Lady Zainab at the time of Karbala was a woman closer to my age than to yours, certainly. She was a woman who was a mother and a wife and a sister. She was a woman of great experience and depth, and showed enormous courage in a terrifying moment, because Karbala, we're inclined to romanticize Karbala. It was a terrible event to see all of these members of the Ahl Bayt being killed one by one, and people like Lady Zainab had to watch them being killed one by one, tried to intervene more than once to save lives and didn't succeed in saving lives, especially of children who went out, who were determined to go and fight. And I was moved by the transformation of her character, because on the day of Karbala, the books, even the Sunni historians say she looked like the sun rising as she walked out onto the field of Karbala, compared to the day before when she'd been quite anxious. On the day of Karbala, she was transformed. On that day, Lady Zainab became everything that God created her to be. He created her for that day and for what she would do on that day. And her transformation was so obvious that it was seen by eyewitnesses who made notes. This woman looked like the sun rising. as she walked out. I have great affinity for her because I think that each one of us has to face moments almost every day where we have to make ethical choices that frighten us because we don't want to be unpopular, don't want to lose friends. You know, the horrible things being done in Gaza at the moment are an example where it's divided humanity because people are frightened to express an opinion now in case they get attacked by the other side and accused of all kinds of things. But we have to make these stands for what is just. And Lady Zeynep gives me great courage as an older person, gives me great courage that even as one gets older, one can still make these stands and be transformed in a moment with courage to do that.
Even the high spiritual state of sincerity and submission to God when she says ما رأيت إلا جميلة or اللهم تقبل منا هذا القربان.
If you can walk into a terrible situation and still be able to say I see nothing but beauty, then it means that you have a connection, a submission to God which is extraordinary. That you are so close to God in a sense that you are so submitted to Him that you see His hand working even in situations that seem terrible.
And Professor, about the Lady Fatima, Sayyida Fatima, Zahra alayhi salam, if you wanted to present her as a summary to a person, to a Western reader or a person who's not Muslim, who he wants to know what's so special and important about this lady, so how can you summarize her life, the virtuous qualities and character in several minutes? Who's Zahra and what does it mean for humanity and what can we learn from her?
So Lady Fatima is, of course, primarily important because she is the only surviving child of the Prophet of Islam. Even though she doesn't live for very long after her father, she survives him and therefore is the carrier of his blood, the carrier of his bloodline. She is a mother, she is a wife, she is a daughter, but she also is a woman who is exceptionally badly treated. She's badly treated after the death of her father. So besides the fact that she has to cope with enormous sorrow at losing the father to whom she's so attached, she then also has to bear the sorrow of persecution by leadership and by the community, so that she really is a martyr. There's no doubt that Lady Fatima is Shahida. This not even a question for me. But again, I understand that for people who go through terrible things in their lives, especially people who are in some way persecuted verbally or physically, and who suffer trauma, Lady Fatima for me is an exceptional model of sabr, of patience, and of integrity, that from the moment her father dies, she is determined that the Islam that is preached and is lived is going to be the Islam of her father, that came down through revelation, not some new version created by a political leadership. And she maintains this integrity in the face of enormous persecution, watching her husband lose his rightful position, but watching people take from her land that belongs to her. She maintains this integrity that no matter what is done, she's going to make sure that the Islam that is lived is the Islam that her father brought, not some new creation for political reasons. And I think in that alone, she was a radiant and extraordinary woman and a model for society of integrity.
You mentioned, Professor, that she was Shahida. So how did you discover that she was Shahida? What's your evidence given your historical study about this issue?
Well, the first thing, of course, is that the books of hadith say that there are a number of ways of being a martyr. It may not necessarily be being killed in battle. There are other ways in which people are martyred, and various books give lists of how one can be a martyr. But in her case, her martyrdom is the persecution that she goes through, and even a physical abuse that happens at her house after the Saqifa, the event at Saqifa. After that event, the attack on the house, the threats against the house, at that time, her children would have been present. Certainly, Al-Hassan, Al-Hussein, Zainab, perhaps also present as very young children, and would have been traumatized. So this is a mother who's seen her own children traumatized, her home threatened, and then of course is injured in an act of violence, an act of harshness perpetrated against her house, and loses this child that she's carrying in her womb. So in all of that, her moral suffering, her physical suffering, her spiritual suffering, she truly qualifies as a martyr. I don't see any question about that.
And she also returned to God and left this dunya in only 75 or 90 days after the Prophet Muhammad. So she didn't live too much, which shows her tragedy.
Yeah, I think that her martyrdom begins during the life of her father, because there are a number of incidents where she sees her father being abused verbally, and she tries to protect him and cover and shield him. And I think already her martyrdom has begun. But then to lose him, and she laments that that's the end now, no more visits from Jibreel, that it's all coming, it's all going to end now. So there's a martyrdom in the loss of her father, and then she's not left to mourn and to grieve. She has to face all of these political maneuverings and injustices. So I have no doubt that her martyrdom is a true martyrdom. It's not just a nice thing we say about her. I think she genuinely died eventually of a heart that was broken by the wickedness that she saw around her.
And there is also the saying which is Imam Ali said after her death, and was ستنبئك ابنتك بتضافر أمتك عليها فاستخبرها الحال واستحفها السؤال فكم من عليل معتلج في صدرها لم تجد إلى بثه سبيلا. Something similar, which shows the spiritual and the physical and the tragedy that she went through. And
she I mean, even the story surrounding her burial, her funeral and her burial, she was wasted away. She didn't want it to be seen. She wanted to be covered. And and then you have to keep saying to yourself, this is the daughter of the Prophet. This is not just another member of the Ummah. And then you have to repeat this when you deal with the killing of Al-Hussein. This is not just some political upstart in the Ummah. This is the grandson of the Prophet and the son of Ali who is being murdered. It is extraordinary that these things should have happened so quickly. And that's why I think they are important to keep reminding ourselves of how human beings can betray the ideals and how human beings can turn unfaithful within moments that easily. I think it's very important that the members of the Ahlul Bayt remind us of these issues.
So, Doctor, the tragedies in the oppression that Lady Zahra faced, it's not only a matter of analysis or opinion or a Shi'i understanding of what happened in history, but due to your studies and what you discovered, it's historical realities which can be proved easily. True?
Even the Sunni books, such as Tabari, talk about this attack on the house and the fact that something bad really happened. He doesn't go into detail, Tabari. And Tabari is an interesting historian because he's a Sunni, of course, but he seemed to have great sympathy, I think, towards Al-Hussein in his Maqtal, the Maqtal that's in his history. But he describes the attack on the house of Lady Fatima. And without going into detail, he makes it clear to the reader something bad happened there. And then he moves on. So it's quite clear that even the historians who were not attached to Ali and to his Shia, even they understood that all was not well. And we record, I mean, we know that afterwards, the leadership of that new leadership of Islam thought that perhaps they'd acted too hastily, that they'd made a falter, a slip. We know this, it exists in the books. So, it's one of the reasons why, and I know that some of my Shia friends get really frustrated that I use Sunni sources, but we have to use Sunni sources. We have to find in the Sunni sources that these things are quite clearly there and written, so that nobody can say, well, this is just an invention of Shia historians. No, it's quite clear in the books of those who are not in any way attached to Ali. And for me, this has always been important in defending a particular vision of the members of the Ahlul Bayt.
It's interesting that as a Christian professor or as an historian who studies this stuff, you can talk freely about it, but within the Islamic community, Shi'i people are always, they say, is it a wisdom to talk about this because it creates hatred or divisions between people? So they concentrate on talking about it in special gatherings or in the dhikra or the shahada of Ahl al-Bayt, but they don't try to talk about it in general publicly. So, but you believe that these are historical and academic studies and realities that can be taken and presented and explained very thoroughly. What do you believe here? Because you are outside our society and these divisions and the problems.
Yeah, it is easier for me, of course, but it would be like saying, well, we can't talk about Karbala. Let's just not mention it. Let's just pass over it because it was a really bad moment for Islam. Yes, it was a very bad moment for Islam, of course, but history is history. And I think that especially now there is this culture of attempting to eradicate all kinds of personalities and things from history which we don't like or don't agree with. So, but that's not how history works. The fact is that in the middle of a city, you have a statue of a man. He was a slave owner when he was living 500 years ago. It's pointless pulling the statue down and making the history go away. The history is not going to go away. That statue is a constant reminder of the things we need never to permit again. So I think that it's important to talk about these things. And, we're talking about a moment in history from which we've moved on. God willing, inshallah, we've moved on from this history. But the history reminds us of the things we may never do again, never repeat again. And it's important to keep reminding ourselves because we forget very, very easily where we've come from and we make the same mistakes very easily.
Interesting and beneficial, Professor. So we talked about Sayyida Zainab and Sayyida Zahra and a bit about Karbala, but I'll go to the real figure who is the main or the complete manifestation of Prophet Muhammad, which is Imam Ali. So have you also worked on Imam Ali or studied about him, wrote a book, and what's the thing that makes Imam Ali differentiated from all the other great people in the Islamic history?
So I'm ashamed to say that I have not studied too much about Imam Ali. That's partly because I've been working on other things. I am busy reading a number of texts about him, and I will give a conference in Milan next January about how Imam Ali's virtues are reflected in his daughter, Lady Zainab, that she is the tongue. I think the text says she is the tongue of her father, and therefore I will try to speak a little about him. It's just that I've been involved with all kinds of other personalities, and I haven't had time really to look at his very complex life, because there are many levels and layers to the life of Imam Ali, and I think that he needs to be treated with great reverence because he's a complex and important character. So at the moment, I have done very little about him. I understand, of course, that he is utterly the manifestation, but I've been so much involved with his children and with Lady Fatima, and now with, of course, his son Al-Abbas as well, that I haven't really had opportunity to study him too much. But I will eventually. I will get to Imam Ali, of course.
كلهم نور واحد. They are all one light, as we say. So
they are all one light, and they're reflected in each other. So you want to know about the virtues of Imam Ali, you will see them in Al-Hussein and Lady Zainab and Al-Abbas, perfectly reflected. And I think that it all eventually will lead back to him. And then he, in a sense, is reflected by the Prophet. He reflects the Prophet as well. So you have this ongoing reflection of the virtues passed down from generation to generation. But they are all one light. This is true.
It's interesting for me, this phenomenon that many Christian thinkers and writers, especially in Lebanon and the Arabs, they all wrote about Imam Ali as a very great personality with human virtues, with virtues that are beneficial for all humanity, and there are books during these several decades. But also during my humble interviews experience, I also found many Western professors and Christian scholars who are very fascinated with the personality of Imam Ali and his virtues and Nahj al-Balagha and these high spiritual states and qualities that he manifested and showed, and it's very interesting for me.
Nahj al-Balagha is of course quite a complex work, and not easy for the Western mind to grasp the concepts of Nahj al-Balagha because it's written from a completely different perspective. And I know my own students have attempted to read some of it at least and struggle with it because the issues are quite complex and they're again series of levels. But I think I'm seeing a resurgence in studies of Imam Ali. I think there are more and more people, as you say, in the West who are beginning to take up his life and elements of his life or of his writings. Some of the prayers he wrote some of the most beautiful prayers. And I think people are beginning to examine some of these texts again. So there will be a resurgence in his life. As there's been in the West, a resurgence in studies of al-Hussein. He has become more and more known now in the Western world. People know his name and who he was. I think the same will happen to Imam Ali.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So, Professor, I have a question which is related to personal religious or spiritual experiences which happen with people such as yourself or other people. So you're immense totally in studying Islam, which is centralized on the idea of Tawheed, which is different than your theological doctrines and beliefs. So then how come, so you keep a distance from these beliefs, or no, you try to understand the light, wisdom, virtues that also manifest in a belief that's centralized on Tawheed also?
Well, of course, Christianity insists that it teaches Tawheed, monotheism. It's a different understanding of monotheism. I accept that. But Christianity, together with Islam and Judaism, these are the three great monotheistic families, each with a particular understanding of Tawheed. I also understand that Christianity does not stress monotheism in its daily spirituality as much as Judaism and Islam, that we have a different stress that we place. But since I have always professed monotheism, always professed that I believe in one God only, because there can only be one God, this has never been a particular issue, except of course that I know that the whole of the Islamic faith is driven by this question of Tawheed, built and solidly upon it, and I understand that, which is different from the way Christianity approaches it. It's never been a real clash any more than the question of whether Muhammad is a prophet or not. So obviously for non-Muslims or for Christians, he is a prophetic person, but wouldn't be called a prophet. But this has never been a barrier to listening to what he has to say, and to attempting to take into our lives or my life some of the most important things that are spoken through him in the text of the Quran. For example, the Quran should be read by everybody because it is whether somebody accepts it as revelation is one question. Nobody can deny that it is a book filled with great wisdom and spiritual insight, however you understand it, and therefore any text like that is worth reading, no matter who you are. So I've always maintained a kind of an openness to these issues, and I understand that whenever Muslims and Christians enter any form of dialogue, it's always a question of the Christian Trinitarian monotheism and the Islamic Unitarian concept of God.
So what I mean, like Tawheed compared to the Trinity or doctrine of Trinity. This is what I mean, because for Muslims it's a very strong barrier because it's like transferring the one God to three gods, and then there is many logical issues there. Yeah.
So quite clearly, not three gods. I don't know any Christian theologian who would say three gods. No, one God who manifests distinctly in three distinct persons, but one God, one substance. There has never been a time, except perhaps at the beginning in some heretical communities. And I think there were some Christians in Arabia who who did not accept the Trinity. In fact, I think the more I read the texts, I think that the Prophet, in his daily encounters with Christians, he met both groups. I think he met Christians who were what we would call Unitarians. In other words, they professed belief in one God and they did not believe in a Trinity. And I think he also encountered Christians who were Trinitarian Christians, which was the definition of the church councils, that God is one God in three distinct persons. And I think that the Prophet himself in these encounters understood that there was a difference between these two groups. But it's never been, I have to say, a real issue for Christians that we lie awake puzzling over how God can be one but three persons. It's never been an issue, but it's very clear that it's not three gods. If a Christian says three gods, then that person cannot be a Christian. They are an idolater, quite clearly.
This is the issue of Trinity. I know it's one God, but then the tajassud in three entities. Because in Islam, you'll say we talk about manifestation, tajalli. Okay, God manifests in great prophets, but he doesn't yatajassad in Jesus, or he's not three. He's one. The manifestations are lower than him. Our levels are created from him. So this creates a barrier, and he says, I can't justify, I can't understand it even logically. So what would you say, or what's your understanding of this issue in a justified or a logical manner? Or
the real issue for us is that it remains a great theological mystery, because God is mystery. But this is, in terms of the gospel, this is how God has revealed himself as one God, not in three manifestations, but in three persons, three distinct persons. So it's not just God manifesting himself in a man called Jesus. No, that's not what it is at all. It is one God, three persons who share the very nature of God. Now, there are endless books written about this, but the truth is, without kind of trying to escape from the argument, the truth is that in the end, we have to, as Christians, bow before the mystery, bow in reverence before God's mystery, and say, well, I don't understand this, but we accept the gospel, we accept the New Testament, and this is how God has revealed himself. Jesus quite clearly uses the divine name for himself, which means that he quite clearly is not just claiming to be a spokesperson. Quite clearly, Jesus uses the formula of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit more than once in the Gospels. So this is the revelation. Now, I know the question from the Islamic side. I know the argument about tahrif. I know all of these arguments. But for Christians, the Gospels are the text of revelation that we dedicate our lives to, as Jews do the Torah, and we have to bow before. I mean, even a Muslim has to reverence the mystery of Tawheed. It cannot be explained simply philosophically. It is a mystery of God's greatness and God's grandeur, that God is one. And although we can find some human language to describe it, in the end, it is mystery, because God has revealed enough for us to journey our lives towards him, but he has not made a complete revelation of himself. He's not completely removed the veil so that everything can be understood about God. So, I mean, it's equally hard for us to explain why God should choose to, for a particular moment in time, become human and suffer on behalf of humans. This is a very great thing for us. It is the center of our faith, but to describe why God should do that, because on the other hand, God can do as he pleases. This is a very strong theology also in Islam, that God, kun fayakun, God is not bound by our limited mental capacities, and he's not bound by our limited understanding of how God is. God is free. If God should choose to become a human being and die, then no matter how, or die as a human being, no matter how complex they may seem to us, God is free to do this. We cannot restrict that. So in the end, as Christians, I mean, there are plenty of theologians who've written books, but in the end, we have to stand in reverence before the mystery and say, I'm a Christian, I believe in the gospel, and this is how God has revealed himself in the gospel, and therefore I have to stand before this and without being able to justify it necessarily. You and I, as believers in God, have the same problem with non-believers. We could spend our lives trying to persuade people that God exists, but in the end, God is mystery. In the end, faith is a gift that God gives to people, and they're free to reject it if they should wish to do that. But no philosophical argument, even the medieval arguments of Thomas Aquinas and the arguments of Al-Ghazali, none of these arguments have persuaded the whole world that God exists, because in the end, you cannot give 100% rational, logical argument for the existence of the God who's revealed himself, The reason God reveals himself is because there are things we cannot know that he has to tell us. And so already it shows that we are hugely limited in our mental capacity, that there are things that I'm absolutely dependent upon for God to tell me that I can't work out. So I've spoken for years about these issues, and more and more I say to people, we have to just stand before this mystery and say, well, I don't understand it. I will keep trying to, but in the meantime, I'm not going to refuse to submit my life to God and surrender.
Very interesting, especially the point that you mentioned, that God is a mystery, and these theological doctrines that anyone holds, it can't understand the reality and the mystery of God. That's why we say وَفَوْقَ كُلِّ ذِي عِلْمٍ عَلِيمٍ, or وَمَا أُوتِيتُم مِّنَ الْعِلْمِ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا, or we say also سُبْحَانَكَ أنت كما أثنيت على نفسك لا نحصي ثناء عليك, or also there is this saying from the Prophet Muhammad, ما عبدناك حق عبادتك وما عرفناك حق معرفتك, or سبحان من لا طريق إلى معرفته إلا بالعجز عن معرفته. The point that you mentioned, that God is a mystery and our understandings are very limited, is a very important point, and it gives humbleness and also in knowledge, that a person should always develop and improve his understanding and his faith and his spiritual journey, and to be closer to God, and don't let these doctrines to create a barrier from him and from his path towards transcendence towards God. And also other people, through their theologies, they are trying to seek and understand and become closer to God also. This is an important point.
I think that the phrase you used, subhanahu or subhana, I think that this, for me, is a crucial phrase, because most people translate it as praise God, but it doesn't mean that. It doesn't mean praise God. It means God is far removed or far above. The Arabic, I think, sabaha, means to swim. It means to float above the water. And when we say subhanahu, what we mean is he is far above anything we can say about him. He is far removed from any statements that we can formulate for ourselves about him. Even if those statements are correct, he is still above them. And it's one of the first things I teach my students when we study Quran. I say, look at this word. Let's, from the beginning, understand what this word means. It means that no matter what I tell you in this class, for the next 6 months, God is above it, far above it. And if we can remember that, then we protect the mystery, and we don't leave our fingerprints all over things that are holy.
Tasbih is tanzih. So we also say Allahu Akbar means Allahu Akbar min an yusaf. You can't even describe him. He's unlimited. He's above what you would describe.
So the reason that God has given us revelation is to tell us the things we need to know. This is absolutely clear. There are certain things, and you as a Shia, you know that we use our aql, we must use our reason to figure things out, and that reason is a very important part, and it's one of the things that unites the Shia and the Catholics, because we both believe in the use of reason, but that revelation is primary, and that God reveals because of all the things our reason cannot tell us about eternity and about how life should be lived. And I think that we have to keep reminding ourselves that all my reason can tell me just a fraction, but it cannot tell me how I can end my life and be in Jannah, in the garden with God. It doesn't tell me that. I need God to tell me that.
Interesting. And Doctor, so you also worked on what you say the Christian perspective of Imam Hussein's humanity. So what do you mean by that? So is it another understanding about Imam Hussein which is different than Muslims or Shia understand? So it's a Christian understanding?
It's really the idea that let's start on an historical level. There are great similarities between Al-Hussein as he is understood in Shia Islam and Jesus as he's understood in Christianity. And in fact, these parallels exist also between Lady Fatima and Mary, but not Maryam. I'm not talking about Maryam in the Quran, but Mary in Catholic theology. So you have two men, whatever else we can say about them, you have two men who have their lives taken from them. It's not just that people give their lives. Sometimes martyrs have their lives forcibly taken from them because they refuse to compromise with truth. They refuse to compromise with what is just. And therefore, there are two men who die for their integrity, for the sake of their integrity. And therefore, so when I was very young, when I was beginning to study, one of the first books I ever read was a book by Mahmoud Ayoub. So he was a Shia. He died a few months ago, Mahmoud Ayoub. He was a Shia scholar working in America. He wrote a book which still causes some controversy because he suggested in the book that somehow the death of al-Hussein redeemed Islam, that somehow it brought healing to the whole of Islam. And that's a very interesting idea for us because that's what we say about Jesus, that his death is redemptive, his suffering is redemptive. So I see huge parallels between al-Hussein and Jesus, aside from what their faith communities say about them, define them as, just as two men who both stand for the truth and both suffer the penalty for standing for the truth, both of whom appear to be losing. I mean, let's be honest, at Karbala, you had al-Hussein and his 70-something companions against thousands. Quite clearly, he did not look as though he was on the winning side. But that's because the victory of al-Hussein is a different type of victory entirely, not seen by those who cannot look with faith. Jesus, too, seems to be defeated completely. And the moment he's killed, all his followers are killed as well. And yet, the victory is a different type of victory. And so I think that there are important parallels between these two, and therefore also their mothers. You have these two women who are extraordinarily powerful intercessors on Yawm ad-Din. I mean, the intercession, the prerogatives given to Lady Fatima are extraordinary on what she will accomplish on that particular day of judgment. But they are also both women of great sorrow, weeping over the murder of their sons. And they are mothers, both of whom lose their beloved sons, taken from them by the hands of others. And so I think that, again, for mothers today who are losing their sons' lives are being taken by others. I think that these two women should not be overlooked as models of inspiration, of great hope as well.
Interesting. So if you would please elaborate more in the comparison between Lady Fatima and Mary here, Sayyida Zahra alayhi salam and Mary, and also you mentioned about weeping and crying on their children. So this is also mentioned in the Christian understanding about Mary?
So first of all, both are named Batul. Lady Mary in Catholicism is the Virgin, and Lady Zeynep is named Batul. It's a different understanding perhaps of virginity, but nonetheless, it's all the purity and all the integrity that goes with it. So they're both virgins. They're both mothers of extraordinary sons. They both lose their sons, although Fatima is already no longer alive when al-Hussein is killed. She is present spiritually, but she is no longer alive. Whereas Mary, when Jesus is killed, she is present. She's still alive. And therefore, they both become known as mothers of sorrow. So this kind of idea of the Beit al-Ahzan, the house of sorrow, dominated by the personality of Lady Fatima, who weeps over the murder of her son, and her weeping is, part of her weeping is intercessory. She's making intercession before God, not only that he will save those faithful to Al-Hussein and to Ali, but also that God will punish the murderers of her son. Mary in Catholicism is a powerful intercessor. She also weeps. She's the sorrowful mother, and her tears are part of her intercession for all those who try to remain faithful to her son and to all that her son taught. And so these weeping intercessors, both of them women figures. It's very interesting for me always that the secular world always criticizes the Catholic Church and Islam for pushing women down. No, at the heart of these two faiths, you have these two women who have more power than you can imagine, given them by God. It's all by God's permission. It's not that they've deserved this. It's all bidnillah. And why would God choose to give such power to a woman if religion is so ill-treating women all the time? No, it's not true at all. It's just that, again, secularism looks at things from completely the wrong angle. So I'm fascinated by both Lady Mariam in Catholicism and Lady Fatima. Now, there are things in the book that I spoke about, for example, the isma of Lady Fatima. Because in Catholicism, Mary is also regarded as sinless, as cleansed from the instant of her conception by God. She is cleansed from sin. So there you have another fascinating parallel that greatly interests me about these two women who God, again, by his permission, it's all because God allows it. God has rendered them sinless. And I think this is very interesting.
Also in the Quranic theme, so السيدة مريم إن الله طهرك واصطفاك وطهرك على نساء العالمين, and then also إن الله يرزق من يشاء. كلما دخل عليها زكريا المحراب وجد عندها رزقا قال أن لك هذا قالت ومن عند الله إن الله يرزق من يشاء بغير حساب. So the Sayyida Maryam in the Islamic understanding has a very holy and spiritual state. We have very few women in the Quran other than the prophets, which are only 3 or 4, and one of them is Sayyida Maryam. Sayyida Maryam, the verses about Sayyida Maryam, it's very special also.
Well, there is that hadith, although I'm not sure if it is accepted as sahih or not. The hadith about Satan touching the children of all except the offspring of the mother of Lady Mariam, of Isa, I think of Isa. Yeah, the hadith says that of all the women sons, Satan's, the only one he never touched, of course, was Isa as he was born. I think that's the hadith. I'm getting old now, I can't always remember these things, and I'm not also sure if the hadith is accepted as Sahih or Hassan, or if it's a problem. But quite clearly, both in Al Imran and also in Surah Maryam, the figure of Mary addressed by the angels, conversing with the angels, the one who prostrates and is humble, this comes through very strongly. And we do quite a lot in our courses with our students. I mean, we do Quranic theology, but I always use Surah Al-Imran and Surah Maryam as an example for our students so that they can see the story of Maryam as it develops in the Quranic text and then compare it to the gospel story, and the parallels are quite clear, quite simple.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Professor, if you'd tell us also a bit about your previous book, which is about Abu al-Fadl al-Abbas, just a summary about what influenced you especially about this personality, or things that you didn't know and you knew only about after studying it in depth.
Well, I a few years ago, when I published the book Angels Hastening, which was about the Karbala, it was about the predictions made by Jibreel in the house of Salama to the Prophet about the future murder of his grandson, and some other predictions as well. And when I wrote this book, when I published it in London, I said to some of my Shi'i friends, I think I might write about Al-Abbas. And they really got very excited, quite excited. And they said, no, you must. You really must. And I thought, well, now I've better do it. So it was quite a difficult book because, of course, with Al-Abbas, we know the basics, but we know very little from the primary sources. So the primary sources, we know very little about his childhood, his early life. We have some hints only. And he comes into his own, certainly in the days leading up to Karbala and then Karbala itself. So he is most especially known for the fetching of water, attempting to fetch water, and perhaps being killed as he does that. He's also known clearly that he was the carrier of al-Hussein's standard. But I identified 7 or 8 interventions made by al-Abbas in the days leading up to Karbala, 7 or 8 things that he actually does. And this is recorded by the historians, that he goes to negotiate with the enemy sent there by al-Hussein. Then he goes to persuade them to give them a night when they can pray. Then he goes to calm the woman, always sent by al-Hussein. So I tried to create a biography and then a final chapter, especially about the idea of saqa and what it means to be the water bearer. Why is this so important? Part of the problem with al-Abbas is that he hides behind his brother. Doesn't like to be seen. Al-Abbas draws all the attention onto al-Hussein, and he is a silent figure in the background. He speaks when he has to, but quite clearly al-Abbas wants al-Hussein to be at the center, not himself. And this comes through very clearly, that he's a powerful man, he's a very big man, but he hides himself behind his brother and is absolutely obedient to his brother. He does everything that he gets asked to do, and he gets sent on some really dangerous missions. And then finally he dies doing the thing that he thinks is important, that is trying to fetch water for the woman and the children. And it's a big debate. How many times did he fetch water? Only once? Maybe more than once he fetched water. And when was the moment of his death? Was it with al-Hussein or was it earlier? So I've tried to look at many texts, many of the Muqatil texts, to try and distinguish each of these days leading up to Karbala, from about the 6th or the 7th of Muharram up to Ashura. What was al-Abbas doing on each of those days? It was very interesting. Yeah.
You discovered something special in the days prior to Ashura?
Well, I have to tell you that I discovered that the earliest texts we have, so I got into big trouble in Iran over this, but of course, you can't not use Abu Mikhnaf. Whatever people say, he is a source, and he is reflected and repeated and used by all the early Sunni historians. And so, you can't avoid and say, well, I refuse to use Abu Mikhnaf. And I say, no, I'm an historian. I'm going to use everything I can find. So the story of al-Abbas fetching water. So the story of al-Abbas fetching water, as it's told by the earliest accounts, that is Abu Mikhnaf, and then repeated, because Abu Mikhnaf's text we don't have, but we have fragments of it in the early Sunni historians. And the truth is that the Shia Islam did not produce many historians at the beginning. The historians came later. And so the earliest history, we have to look to some of the Sunni texts. Well, the story as it's told by the earliest accounts is slightly different from the later version, which comes around Al-Qadi al-Nu'man, around the 4th century, I think. He begins to tell the story from a Shia perspective, and it's slightly different and I try to trace how the story developed and changed. On what day did al-Abbas fetch water? How many times did he fetch water? And when he was killed, was it while he was fetching water, or was it while he and al-Hussein were together attempting to reach a water source? All of these stories are told slightly differently. And I'm not going to decide this one's, I just want the reader to see how the story has developed. The fact that it's recorded by the early historians means it's a very important story. It's not just something that happened on the day of, no, the story of al-Abbas fetching water finds a place in all the most important history books. And therefore, I think it's a very important text.
You also researched about his role prior to Karbala, so in the battles with Imam Ali and his personality and characters. You found things there?
Well, again, this is quite a big problem because, many people say that he fought at Siffin, but it's hard to find any primary sources that mention him being there. There was another man called Al-Abbas who wore the clothing of Ali and rode his horse, but it wasn't his son Al-Abbas, it was another Al-Abbas in some of the texts. Al-Abbas would have been about 11 or 12 years old at the Battle of Siffin. So, the stories of him killing hundreds of the enemy, as a historian, I struggle with some of those stories, obviously. But more important for me was how few texts I could find that actually put him there, or at least put him there in a fighting role. There are texts which tell us he was present, but the idea that he actually fought at Siffin. There are texts in which Ali forbids him and others to fight the children. He won't allow them to fight. So again, you know, I have great devotion to him, but I also want to produce a history that is faithful to what the texts say.
Other information about him before Karbala, his relation to Imam Ali and what he learned from his father, or other things, or his relation to his brother Hassan Hussein before Karbala. So I think there are several details can be mentioned here, or few.
Only in secondary sources. In secondary texts, we have how he is named. al-Banin brings him to Ali to be named. The meaning of his name, al-Abbas. Again, in Iran, some of the people say, no, you must call him Abu al-Fadl. No, al-Abbas is the name given him by his father. And it's because he has the fierceness of a lion. This is why his father names him that. So his father, who is Imam and has the foresight of the Imam, gives him a name that reflects what he's going to do later on. Abu al-Fadl is his laqab, which is fine, but I think his name al-Abbas is much more important. So we have some stories about his naming. We have some stories about the fact that he lived with his brother al-Hassan for a while, then with his brother al-Hussein until Karbala. But many of these are secondary sources, and secondary sources often mediate the primary sources. I like to see, first of all, what the historians say, and then work from there.
Interesting. Professor, I'll ask you also about the phenomena of conversion, because we witness several professors and scholars, Western or Christian, when they study Islam and they become attracted to its knowledge and characters. Some take the decision of converting or being very positive about Islam, or just being somewhere in the middle. So how do you perceive and analyze this phenomena? And personally yourself, did you think something similar, or no? You have your own understanding, just as you explained that you respect both and you stay at your point.
I have great respect and reverence for Islam. I've never thought of converting. I am truly devout, convinced Christian and Catholic, and so convinced that I became a priest. And I've never ever thought of converting, but I am happy to take from Islam all of the wisdom, all of the piety, anything that will help my own journey and make it a better journey, because God is present at work outside of our own traditions. And I'd hate to try and trap God in one tradition and keep him there. And so one of the things I try to teach my students is you don't have to agree with something, but you have to stand in reverence before a religious faith that has changed the lives of millions and millions of people. It's not as if it's a handful of people who've read a text called Quran and they liked it. No. Millions of people down through the centuries, billions of people have had their lives shaped and formed forever and definitively by the person of the Prophet and by the text of Quran. That's not something for me to take lightly. I take it very seriously and stand with great reverence before it. But
how do you perceive the people who chose the decision of conversion? Or every person has his own spiritual journey and he can choose whatever he likes. So, because you know them, obviously, and most of them are Christian, not even other religions. So they're not Buddhists, they're not Jews. So there is something here that is linked. So that's why I'm asking.
I firmly believe in religious freedom. I think religious freedom is the most important freedom, because all human beings from day one have worshipped. It's the one thing that has been common to all humanity. From day one, we have turned to worship. And therefore, the most fundamental freedom for me is religious freedom, that people must be allowed to follow their religious journey and their spirituality. And I have to say, whether that's from Islam into something else or from something else into Islam, for me, it should be equal, because again, God is above these things. And I would hate to try and control how God works in a human being and how God leads a human being. And I know that sometimes, maybe often, we make mistakes. We think God wants us to do something, but he doesn't. But that's part of the journey. So I am a firm believer and upholder of religious freedom. And if I meet Catholics who have become Muslims or Shia, I have no particular issue with that. I'm only interested that they are continuing to search for the truth and search for God, because that's what our universal call is meant to be.
Professor, and we people who are religious, whatsoever our religions were, we face common problems in the era of modernity, so homosexuality and people who are losing their identities and values and all these ethical problems that the societies are facing, our new generations are facing. What do you have to comment here? So what are the main problems that, going back to pure spiritualities, going back to lessons from Ahl-Bayt, that we can gain to overcome such difficulties? And I don't know, you're living in Rome, for example, so what are the main problems that you see, or you go around the world, these problems are common nowadays, so what's something that you'd like to say in this regard?
I think that we are living in a world that has gone far away from God, and it's become a world that God never intended it to be. This is not what he created the world to be as it is now, a world that has separated itself from him. And I think that part of the culture that greatly disturbs me is not atheism or secularism, but militant secularism, militant atheism. In other words, secularism which can't bear the possibility that religion should be allowed to exist. It's one thing for a person to say, look, I don't believe in God, but I respect you to have your belief. That's not the problem we're facing. The problem we're facing is a secularism that is determined to wipe the name of God out if it can. And I see this in England especially. England has become militantly against God. You can't mention God on any of the British media. You can't. They don't want you to talk about God. And I've seen people literally getting cut off by the media the moment they start talking about God. To be a Christian or a Muslim or a Jew or any believer in the West now is becoming increasingly difficult, because there's a real persecution. And in this case, it's a persecution of being pushed to the side and regarded as unimportant in society. So that people struggle. People really struggle. But I think there's also an increase in abuse, substance abuse, alcohol, drugs. And I think that abuse extends into other areas too, like social media, where people's lives have become absolutely fixated and dominated by social media. They get all the information from that, and their whole life is spent living in a parallel universe of social media that doesn't actually exist. I think that we are in serious problem. I think that there's a great deal of anger in the world. People are frustrated and angry by religion and politics and everything else, and violence and warfare. People are tired and frustrated. I think in the moment we're in a very bad place. It's never without hope, but I think we are in a very bad place. And I think what we're seeing happening at the moment in Gaza, the fact that Western humanity has barely bothered about it, barely protested, is almost the death of Western humanity for me. That you could watch that sort of thing unfolding and try to excuse it as though it wasn't that important. That for me is the death, almost the death of any humanity in the West. We have to take a long time to recover our humanity, I think. So I grew up in South Africa. I grew up in the middle of the apartheid years, and then the releasing of Nelson Mandela. And Nelson Mandela said, we in South Africa will never be free until the people of Palestine are free. He said that years ago. So as somebody who grew up in an apartheid system, I know what apartheid looks like. And apartheid is the thing that is being practiced in Gaza, in Palestine, by a state which is now becoming genocidal. They are genocidal. You can't simply carpet bomb women and children as part of your objective and then simply lie about it. The spokesmen simply lie about these things. Now, I don't agree with any group, whether it's Hamas or Hezbollah or the Israeli army killing women and children or harming women and children. So the action of Hamas against women and children, perhaps rather than against a military target, that's debatable. We need to talk about that. That's a big problem for me. But the response has been out of all proportion. And it is, according to the definition of the United Nations, it is genocide. The fact that the great Western powers, America, France, England, refuse to say this is an absolute shame and a scandal. You don't have to be a supporter of Hamas. You don't have to be a supporter even of the Arab cause or of Islam to recognize genocide, to say, I don't care what religion these people are, and I don't care who their leaders are. You can't kill them. You can't just murder children and women. And I'm sorry now that the whole, after the treaty, the peace accord, this peace treaty now, I can't remember the word, this break in fighting, now it started again. And Israel is saying, oh, Hamas broke the... No, they didn't. They didn't do anything of the sort. You did. You started bombing again. So I'm terrified that politicians in America have seemingly no moral conscience at all. They're quite happy to go along with this and say it's fine. And we are asking Israel to be cautious about not killing women and children. What a nonsensical thing to say. Tell them to stop bombing. That's what they need to do, because that's not going to solve the solution. That's not the problem. Is I think that's the aim of the Zionist state, is to completely flatten Palestine and get everybody out. I think that's their aim, and it's been their aim from the beginning. And I'm not a genius, but I can see that. I don't know how other people can't see that. That it didn't begin on the 7th of October. The 7th of October was just part of a long struggle. I'm just sorry that women and children were involved. I think that's always a bad thing. That's never a good thing. But nonetheless, even if women and children were involved, the response has been out of all proportion. And you're quite right. This did not start in October. It started way back in 48, even earlier perhaps. And it's been going on since then. And again, as a South African, I know what apartheid looks like because I lived through it. I was a member of the South African society that practiced it. I know what it looks like, and I know it when I see it, and it's what I've been seeing. I think every oppressed people has a moral duty to fight oppression, because oppression is an act of injustice. And if we don't fight it, it means we're saying it's all right. It doesn't matter. No, it matters. Every oppressed people, no matter who's oppressing them or what's oppressing them, has the moral duty to rise up against oppression. And if, unfortunately, and I stress unfortunately, that sometimes means military rising up or some sort of armed struggle, then it has to be that. We had it in South Africa. We had an armed struggle in South Africa. The black community had to rise up against the minority white community, and violence occurred. We know that it did. I lived through it. I saw it happening. And nobody wants to justify violence. But if you are oppressed and you have reached the last resort and nothing else works and nobody's helping you, then you have to do what you have to do. And I think it's a moral duty. It's a moral duty to remove from power a leader who is corrupt and who is destroying the nation, or a political party or a government that's doing that. It is our moral duty to stand up. And well, of course, Amr bil Ma'ruf, all of this. So whether you use your tongue or your heart or your hand, it all depends on the circumstance. But we know even from Quran that this is an absolute duty. It's not just an option to fight and forbid what is wrong and to command what is good. So it all fits in there.